All right, so are you ready to dive into a topic that's, well, let's just say it's not exactly known for being a page turner?
You're talking about the U.S. federal bureaucracy, right?
Got it. Specifically, how the government manages to hire people, how they manage to manage those people, and how they sometimes manage to, well, let's just say let people go.
Because firing someone is practically impossible in the federal government.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a system most people don't really think about until they need something from it, and then,
It can be a real headache.
to put it mildly. And that's why we're doing this deep dive. We're going to try to make sense of this massive, complex beast.
We'll be using Project 2025 as our guide. Have you had a chance to take a look?
I have. I dove right into Section 1, Chapter 3, all about the central personnel agencies.
Those are the agencies responsible for pretty much everything related to the federal workforce.
They are. It's like the HR department for the entire U.S. government. The sheer scale of it is mind-boggling.
I bet. So what are some of the key takeaways from that chapter? Anything that really jumped out at you?
Well, besides the fact that it's apparently easier to get into Harvard than it is to get fired from a federal job.
You're not kidding. That's one of the things that really stands out in Project 2025, isn't it? The idea that the system is designed to protect employees to such an extent that it can be almost impossible to remove someone, even if they're not performing well or even if they're engaging in some pretty questionable behavior.
Exactly. There's this one crazy story that Project 2025 told about an employee who literally set their office on fire and still kept their job. I mean, how is that even possible?
Well, it all goes back to the merit system.
Ah, yes, the merit system. The idea that government jobs should be awarded based on skills and qualifications, not on political connections.
Right. It was designed to eliminate the spoils system, where government jobs were basically handed out as favors to political allies, which is a good thing, right?
Yeah.
In theory, at least.
Of course, we all want the most qualified people running the government, right?
Absolutely. But like so many well-intentioned ideas, the merit system has had some unintended consequences.
Such as?
Well, the biggest one is that it's made it incredibly difficult to fire anyone, even for serious misconduct. Project 2025 argues that this is because the system is so afraid of lawsuits and so bogged down in appeals processes that it's become practically paralyzed.
So it's like a catch-22. They wanted to create a fair and impartial system, but in doing so, they created a system that's so risk-averse that it can't function effectively.
Exactly. And this leads to all sorts of other problems, including problems with hiring.
Because if it's so hard to fire someone, you really want to make sure you're hiring the right person in the first place, right?
Oh.
So I'd imagine they have some super rigorous screening process, like, I don't know, some kind of super SAT for government jobs.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
I mean, you don't just want anyone walking in and getting a job.
Right.
Especially if it's going to be virtually impossible to get rid of them later.
Exactly. But here's the crazy thing. The federal government hasn't consistently used a proper merit-based exam in over 3 decades.
Wait, are you serious? They just let anyone walk in and grab a job?
No, not exactly, but it's not far off. There used to be a general intelligence exam called the PACE-E.
I've never even heard of that.
Well, it was abolished back in the day because of concerns about discrimination.
I get that. Equal opportunity for all.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Right. But here's the kicker. That abolishment was supposed to be temporary. And fast forward to today, agencies are still largely relying on self-evaluations from applicants.
So basically, you just tell them how great you are, and they believe you.
Pretty much. Project 2025 really lays into this. They say it's led to a situation where credentials and self-promotion are often valued more than actual skills and abilities.
Okay, that makes the whole merit system thing sound a bit ironic, doesn't it? If they're not actually testing people's skills, how can they claim to be hiring based on merit?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that Project 2025 raises throughout the document. They argue that this over-reliance on credentials and self-assessment has led to a workforce that might look good on paper, but doesn't necessarily have the practical skills needed to actually get the job done.
So what are they doing about it? Are there any solutions in the works?
There have been attempts at reform. There was this new exam and development called USA Hire. It was supposed to be more objective and more focused on actual job skills.
Sounds promising. So what happened?
Well, wouldn't you know it, that got stalled as well. Concerns about potential bias.
So it's like every attempt to fix the system gets bogged down by the very bureaucracy it's trying to improve.
It really is.
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it?
It is, and that's just the hiring process. We haven't even gotten into the joys of performance reviews yet.
Oh, boy. Don't tell me everyone gets a gold star just for showing up.
Well, it's not quite that bad, but it's pretty close. Project 2025 highlights this crazy statistic: over 99% of federal employees are rated as fully successful or higher.
99%. You're kidding. So basically everyone's doing a fantastic job. I'm having a hard time believing that.
Right. It just doesn't seem possible, does it? But Project 2025 points to a few reasons why this happens.
Like what? I mean, is everyone really that good at their job or?
I wouldn't go that far. No, it seems like one of the big issues is that there's this deep-seated culture of avoiding conflict within the federal government. Nobody wants to be the bad guy who gives someone a less than stellar review.
Well, yeah, I can see how that would be awkward, especially in a hierarchical environment like that. Nobody wants to rock the boat or make enemies.
Exactly. But the even bigger issue seems to be fear.
Fear of what?
Fear of repercussions. It seems like a lot of managers are terrified of being accused of discrimination or facing lengthy appeals from disgruntled employees if they give someone a negative review. It's just easier to give everyone a good rating and avoid the headache.
So they just kick the can down the road and hope for the best.
It seems that way. And Project 2025 points out that this creates a real problem because it means that poor performers aren't getting the feedback they need to improve, and top performers aren't getting the recognition they deserve.
So it's a lose-lose situation. What's the solution here? Is anyone even trying to fix this mess?
Well, there have been some attempts at reform. Some administrations have tried to streamline the process, empower managers to give more honest feedback, and make it easier to remove truly underperforming employees. But well, let's just say that the bureaucratic machine is pretty resistant to change. It's like trying to turn a giant ship around in a bathtub.
Yeah.
It takes time, effort, and a whole lot of political will, and even then, there's no guarantee of success.
Sounds pretty daunting.
It is. But Project 2025 argues that it's a challenge we have to face head on if we want a government that can actually function effectively in the 21st century.
Okay, so we've talked about hiring, or rather the lack of proper hiring procedures, and we've talked about the challenges of performance reviews,
Yeah.
or rather the lack of honest performance reviews. But what about the elephant in the room, compensation? Are federal employees overpaid, underpaid, or is it all just a matter of perspective?
Ah, yes, the million-dollar question, literally.
Yeah.
It's one of those hot-button issues that people love to debate, and Project 2025 certainly doesn't shy away from it. Officially, studies suggest that federal workers are actually underpaid compared to similar private sector jobs.
Underpaid?
Mm.
Really? But don't they get all those amazing benefits like generous vacation time and great retirement plans?
They do. And that's where the picture starts to get a bit murky. Project 2025 acknowledges that when you factor in the total compensation package, including those benefits, the picture can look a bit different.
So it all depends on how you slice the data.
Precisely. Some independent studies argue that when you consider the whole package, federal employees might actually be overpaid. And then, of course, you have the folks who argue that it doesn't matter how much they're paid because they're all lazy bureaucrats who are just wasting taxpayer money.
Right, because those stereotypes are always helpful.
Exactly. But the point is, it's a complicated issue with no easy answers. And it raises an even bigger question. What's the right balance? How do we attract and retain top talent while also being responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars?
That's a tough one. It's like walking a tightrope between competing priorities. And speaking of competing priorities, we can't talk about the federal workforce without addressing the elephant in the room, or maybe I should say the union in the room. What role do unions play in all of this?
Yes, unions. They definitely wield significant influence within the federal government. And, as you might imagine, their role is often debated.
Right, because on one hand, unions are there to protect workers' rights, ensure fair treatment, and give employees a collective voice, which are all good things, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, some argue that they can hinder efficiency and make it even harder to manage performance, which we already know is a challenge in the federal government.
Exactly. Project 2025 highlights this tension between the need for worker protections and the desire for a more agile and responsive bureaucracy. Unions have a lot of bargaining power when it comes to things like working conditions, disciplinary procedures, and even how performance is evaluated.
Which, as we've discussed, is already a bit of a minefield. So, adding another layer of complexity to an already complex system that doesn't sound like a recipe for success.
But isn't there also a potential upside to having unions involved? Couldn't they help to ensure that any changes made to the system are fair and equitable for employees?
Absolutely. That's the heart of the debate. Do public sector unions ultimately benefit the system by protecting workers and ensuring fair treatment, or do they make it more difficult for the government to operate efficiently and effectively? It's not a simple question. And Project 2025 acknowledges that there are valid arguments on both sides.
This is like everything else we've talked about, isn't it? There are no easy answers. It's all about finding the right balance.
Exactly. And that's why reforming the bureaucracy is such a daunting task. Well, it's certainly been an eye-opening conversation so far. We've only just scratched the surface of this massive and complex topic, but I feel like I'm already starting to get a better understanding of how this system works, or rather, how it sometimes doesn't work. But I'm eager to dive deeper. What else does Project 2025 have to say about the challenges facing the federal bureaucracy?
Hmm. Oh, we've only just begun. We still need to talk about the role of political appointees, the infamous congressional confirmation process, and some of the more controversial proposals for reform, like Schedule F.
Schedule F, that sounds ominous.
It is, but we'll save that conversation for the next installment of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat. Can't wait to unpack all of that.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Buckle up, everybody. We're just getting started. So last time we left off talking about unions and their role in all of this, and I'm curious to learn more about what Project 2025 has to say about the challenges that political appointees face.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting dynamic, isn't it? You've got this permanent bureaucracy made up of career civil servants, and then you've got this layer of political appointees who come in with every new administration.
And they're the ones who are supposed to set the agenda and make sure that the president's vision is actually implemented right.
Exactly. But it's not always that simple. Project 2025 points out that these political appointees often come from outside the government, so they don't necessarily have a deep understanding of how the bureaucracy works.
Well, yeah, you can't exactly learn that stuff in a classroom, can you? It's a whole different world inside the Beltway.
It really is, and they have to navigate this complex web of rules and regulations and relationships, all while trying to implement the president's agenda.
And I imagine they also have to deal with a lot of resistance from the career civil servants who might not be too thrilled about having someone come in and tell them how to do their jobs.
Absolutely. There can be a lot of tension between those two groups, and it's one of the biggest challenges that political appointees face.
So how do they overcome those challenges? What does Project 2025 recommend?
Well, one of the key things they emphasize is the importance of building relationships with the career staff.
So it's all about communication and collaboration.
Exactly. They need to be able to explain their vision clearly and persuasively, and they need to be willing to listen to the concerns of the career staff and find ways to work together.
Makes sense. You catch more flies with honey than with vinegar, as they say.
Right. And they also need to be able to navigate the political landscape.
Meaning dealing with Congress and the media and all those interest groups.
Exactly. Those folks can make life very difficult for a political appointee if they're not careful.
Yeah, it sounds like a high-pressure job with a lot of moving parts. I can see why it's not for everyone.
It definitely takes a certain type of person to thrive in that environment.
Speaking of thriving, I'm curious to learn more about this congressional confirmation process.
Oh, yes. The gauntlet that every political appointee must run.
Tell me about it. It sounds like a real nightmare.
Well, it can be. Project 2025 points out that the process has become increasingly politicized in recent years, with nominees often facing intense scrutiny and partisan attacks.
Yeah, we've all seen those hearings on TV where senators are grilling the nominees about every little thing.
Exactly. And it can take months or even years for a nominee to be confirmed, which can really hamstring an administration's ability to get things done.
Sounds like a built-in delay mechanism.
You could say that, and it's one of the things that makes it so difficult to reform the bureaucracy.
Because even if you have a great idea for how to improve things, you might not be able to get the right people in place to implement it.
Exactly. It's a real catch-22.
Speaking of catch-22s, let's circle back to Project 2025 for a moment.
Sure. What did you want to talk about?
Well, they don't just diagnose the problems, do they? They actually propose some pretty radical solutions.
Oh, yeah, they definitely do. They lay out a whole roadmap for reforming the bureaucracy.
Can you give us a taste of what they recommend?
Well, some of their key proposals include streamlining the appeals process, moving towards a more market-based pay system, and empowering political leadership to have more control over the agencies.
So basically, they want to shake things up a bit, try to break free from the status quo.
You could say that they argue that the current system is just too cumbersome, too risk-averse, and too resistant to change.
And they believe that these reforms would lead to a more agile and responsive bureaucracy.
Exactly. They say it's essential for meeting the challenges of the 21st century.
I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? The world is changing so rapidly, and the government needs to be able to keep up.
Right. But as you might imagine, these reforms are not without their critics.
Well, yeah, change is never easy, especially when it comes to something as big and complex as the federal government.
Exactly. Some people argue that these reforms would go too far and that they would undermine the core values of the merit system.
Like the idea that jobs should be awarded based on qualifications, not political connections.
Exactly. They worry that these reforms would lead to a more politicized bureaucracy where loyalty to a particular administration would be valued more than expertise or merit.
So it's another one of those classic dilemmas, balancing the need for efficiency and accountability with the risk of unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it's a debate that's likely to continue for many years to come.
Speaking of debate, there's one particular proposal in Project 2025 that I'm really curious to hear more about.
Which one is that?
Schedule F.
Ah, yes. That's one of the most controversial proposals in the entire document.
Could you give us a quick overview of what it entails?
Sure. Basically, Schedule F would create a new category of federal employees who are directly involved in policymaking.
So not just the rank-and-file bureaucrats, but the people who are actually shaping the government's agenda.
Exactly. And these employees would be exempt from some of the traditional civil service protections.
Meaning they could be hired and fired more easily.
Exactly. The idea is to give political appointees more control over their staff and to make it easier to implement their agenda.
But wouldn't that also make it easier to politicize the bureaucracy? To stack the deck with people who are loyal to a particular party or ideology?
That's the fear, and it's one of the main reasons why Schedule F has faced so much opposition.
So what happened? Did it ever actually get implemented?
It did briefly. President Trump issued an executive order creating Schedule F in 2020.
But of course, that was right before he left office.
Exactly, and the Biden administration revoked that order shortly after taking office.
So another attempt at reform bites the dust.
You could say that, but the debate over Schedule F is likely to continue.
Well, it certainly raises some important questions about the balance of power between political appointees and career civil servants.
It does, and it's just one example of the many challenges that we face in trying to reform the bureaucracy.
It's a daunting task, but Project 2025 makes a compelling case for why it's so important.
I agree. They argue that the challenges facing the federal government are just too great to ignore and that the status quo is simply unsustainable.
So we need to find a way to make the bureaucracy more efficient, more effective, and more responsive to the needs of the American people.
Exactly, and that's going to require some bold thinking and some tough choices.
Well, I'm certainly glad that Project 2025 is out there sparking this conversation.
Me too. It's an important document, and I think it's going to have a major impact on the debate over the future of the federal government.
Well, I'm eager to keep exploring these ideas with you, but I think we're going to have to save that for our next deep dive.
Sounds good to me. I'm looking forward to it.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? All these competing priorities and challenges. It makes you wonder, where do we even begin to try to fix something as massive and complex as the federal bureaucracy?
Well, I think Project 2025 offers some valuable insights. They really emphasize the need to empower political leadership, to have more control over the bureaucracy, and to make it more responsive to the will of the people.
Which makes sense, right? I mean, ultimately, it's the president and their appointees who are accountable to the voters, so they should have the authority to shape the government and implement their agenda.
Exactly. But of course, there are always risks associated with giving any one group too much power.
Right. It's like we talked about earlier, too much power in the hands of career civil servants leads to all sorts of problems. And too much power in the hands of political appointees has its own set of potential pitfalls as well.
Exactly. And Project 2025 acknowledges that. They talk about the importance of finding the right balance between those two forces, between the expertise and experience of the career staff and the vision and accountability of the political leadership.
So what do they propose? How do we strike that balance?
Well, they have a number of recommendations, some of which are pretty controversial. We already talked about Schedule F, which was an attempt to give political appointees more control over hiring and firing certain types of employees, but that got repealed by the Biden administration.
Right, and I can see why that would be controversial. It sounds like it could easily lead to a situation where loyalty to a particular administration is valued more than actual qualifications.
Exactly, and that's one of the main criticisms of that proposal. But they also recommend the things like streamlining the senior executive service, giving agency heads more flexibility in hiring and firing senior staff, and reducing the number of layers of bureaucracy between political appointees and the people who are actually doing the work.
It all sounds very complicated.
It is. Reforming the bureaucracy is no easy task. But Project 2025 makes a compelling case for why it's so important.
Well, it's definitely been a fascinating deep dive. We've learned about the history of the merit system, the challenges it faces today, and the ongoing debate about how to reform it. But honestly, after all of this, I'm left with even more questions than answers.
Well, that's the nature of a complex system. There are rarely simple solutions to complex problems, and the federal bureaucracy is about as complex as it gets.
It really is. But what I think is so fascinating is that this system, with all of its flaws and challenges, impacts every single one of us in so many ways. From the roads we drive on to the food we eat to the air we breathe, the federal bureaucracy plays a role in almost every aspect of our lives.
It really does, and that's why it's so important to understand how it works, what the challenges are, and what the potential solutions might be. Project 2025 has given us a lot to think about.
It has. So what do you think? Are there any easy answers here?
Yeah.
Is real, lasting change even possible within a system this massive and complex?
I don't know if there are any easy answers, but I do think that change is possible. It's going to require a lot of hard work, a lot of collaboration, and a willingness to experiment and adapt.
Hmm.
And it's going to require us as citizens to be informed and engaged and to hold our elected officials accountable for making the government work better for all of us.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but we've only just scratched the surface of this massive and complex topic. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and I encourage you to continue exploring these ideas on your own. Check out Project 2025, do some research, talk to your friends and family, and let's keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep learning and keep questioning.